Well, thank you, Alison and Sarah. That was fantastic, and I think the work you do is brilliant. I suppose today what I was going to do was look at this concept that Alison introduced, this concept of psychology at work and what we can do in the workplace to mitigate the levels of stress. And as Alison said, that pre-COVID, I think we had a figure of about 15% of the workforce would fulfill the diagnostic criteria for a psychological problem, and that has been massively increased. Some people would say doubled by COVID. And when we go through periods of disruption, change, uncertainty, these black swans, as Nassim Taleb calls them, actually do really disrupt our psychological health. What I'd like to talk to you about today is this concept of resilience. But we do a lot of work with corporate clients, and one of the things I ask, or we all ask our clients at the beginning is, do you think psychological well-being is important? And if you do think it's important, what do you think it impacts on? What do you think it has tentacles into? Well, when we ask that question now, the commonest answer that people give us is everything. And it does impact on everything. At an individual level, it impacts on our brain chemistry, it impacts on our physiology, it impacts on our physical health. It actually impacts on our genes and the expression of our genes. And this is a process which many of you will know about called epigenetics. It also impacts on your telomeres, the little caps on the end of your chromosomes. But it also impacts on our families and our friends and our colleagues. And I think I worked in the NHS for over 30 years, and I think you're seeing now the impact of psychological distress and burnout on the colleagues who are still at work. And I think it's placing this, I think, into a wider context. And I think, as Alison also alluded to, this has huge implications for organizations, for business success, but also for society as a whole. And I think what I'd like to share with you today is that there are many of you will know this, but there are some incredibly transformative changes occurring in the brain sciences. And these advances, I think, are now informing what we can do in terms of being proactive. So the question really is, what can businesses do and what works at work? And I think that's a really important thing to think about. And I'd like to link individual psychological health to a wider construct of the environment and the ecosystem in which we exist. And so I'm going to try and create an integrative approach to this, where we combine a bit of the biology, the physiology, what's going on in us, the physical side, with the psychological and with the social. So this has a title of biopsychosocial, but I'd like to just pull those three areas together because they do connect incredibly powerfully. But I think to Alison's other point is the business case. I think the danger is that unless there is a business case, it's going to be difficult to maintain a momentum of actually driving this agenda through and making sure that change occurs. And I think, for CFOs and for CEOs and for the leadership, they have to recognize that this is now a key performance indicator, a key quality indicator, a key reputational indicator. And I was listening, interestingly, to one of your colleagues at CMHA, Henrietta Jewett, talking to Professor Emmanuel. And I was really struck by his big data. And what he's shown using that big data is that psychological problems and unhappiness drives poor performance, poor productivity, and impacts on profitability. And good psychological health actually improves performance, productivity, and profit. And what he's also shown is that companies that invest in psychological health, and I'm going to share some data with you later from our own research, outperform other organizations in the good times, but they also outperform organizations in the bad times. So I think we have to make a really powerful argument for why we should be doing this. And I think, as Alison said, if we don't make that argument and it's really powerful and understandable, then I think when things get tough, these are the sort of things that get cut. But I think they're the sort of things that actually, when things get tough, you should be investing in. And there's the paradox, really, the irony. Okay, I'm just going to whiz you through a few ideas around this, if I can get my slides to shift. And here we go. Okay, I'd like to just start, and many of you will have heard me talk about this before, if you've heard me talk before, is this concept of risk factors and protective factors. But what I'd like to just frame this, and this is the Zola metaphor that many of you will know, which is that he tells a lovely story trying to prompt medicine to move upstream, where he describes a man going for a walk, hiking through the woods, and he comes into a clearing and he sees a river. And he follows the bank of the river down, and he sees somebody who appears to be pulling bodies out of the river. And he observes this man for a little while. He goes up to him and says, you know, what are you doing? And this guy says, well, I'm a doctor and I'm saving these people's lives because they're drowning in the river. And the passerby says, oh, that's fantastic. What a great job. Well done. Brilliant. And the doctor says, well, it is, but I'm so busy pulling them out of the river, I don't have time to go upstream to see who's pushing them in or why they're falling in. Now, I think this is a concept that medicine took on board, and we've now moved upstream in medicine in a whole range of conditions, particularly chronic illnesses. We look at what the risk factors are. And if you mitigate those risk factors, you can make a huge difference to the trajectory of an illness, whether that's diabetes, metabolic syndrome, ischemic heart disease. But the interesting thing is you can also create a range of protective factors that if people do certain things, they can manage their condition much more effectively. Now, these make a real and measurable impact. Now, the interesting thing is, I think in medicine we've done that, but in psychology and psychiatry, we tend to wait for people to be ill. We tend to try and pull them out of the water. And I think there's a really exciting space for organizations to move upstream and to be proactive. Now, the reason for that is that I think knowing about these risk factors and protective factors actually creates a sense of autonomy. It creates a sense of agency. It actually is an antidote. And I think one of the tragedies is that when we fall in the water, which most of us do, in fact, if you look at the longitudinal research, the Dunedin study, the majority of us are going to experience psychological problems at some point in our life, because life can throw us curveballs. There can be upsets, distress, and problems. So I think distress and unhappiness are part of the human condition. What we should be doing is helping people recover their equilibrium. So I would suggest that most of us fall in the water. The question is, can we swim? Have we got buoyancy aids? Have we got things that help us get to the bank a bit quicker? Or are we doing things that keep us in the water, that drag us deeper into the water? And there is a tragedy about psychological distress, and I mean that genuinely in the real sense of the term, is that psychological distress actually makes us do things inadvertently and unintentionally that make us stay stuck in the water. We often become self-critical, we become avoidant, we become withdrawn, we become irritable. We stop doing things that actually help us recover our equilibrium. Now, we don't do those intentionally, and I think understanding those risk factors and those protective factors could be very enabling. So just to bring this to life as a performance indicator, if you look at people when they're flourishing, when they're feeling well, their brain is online. They can access all areas. Their cognitive function is optimal. Their concentration, their memory, their decision making. Now, it's not difficult to measure cognitive function. And what you can see is that if people become significantly stressed, their cognitive function starts to be impaired, their cognitive fitness. Now, this has huge implications for most of us. And in any form of work, it can be important, but complex work, it's particularly relevant. And there's a problem when our cognitive function isn't great, because if you're a lawyer or an accountant or a doctor, you start to worry about your cognitive function. So actually, we can then start to feel stressed about feeling stressed, which can make us feel uber stressed. And that's often called a metacognition or a meta-emotion. And getting distressed about being distressed is a fantastic risk factor for getting stuck in the water. The other thing that can happen when we're languishing or feeling distressed or becoming unwell is that we can have physical impact. Now, your physical health is impacted massively. There's a big area of medicine called psychoneuroimmunology that's been looking at this for a very long time. And we know that chronic stress, and I want to differentiate chronic stress from acute stress, because chronic stress is a pathway to mental health problems, whereas acute stress is something that we all experience. But chronic stress pushes up your cortisol. It impacts on your immune function. It increases inflammatory problems in your brain and body. It impacts on your long-term memory. It impacts on a range of chronic diseases. So I just want to emphasize this isn't just psychological. Your psychological health has huge implications for your physical health and your longevity. And we should be striving much harder to help people with their psychological well-being because of its impact on physical health. And then finally, behavior. Your behavior when you're flourishing tends to be more pro-social, friendly, you're more outward going, you connect with your fellow man and woman. When you start to get stressed or distressed, you often become avoidant, you become withdrawn, you become irritable. The milk of human kindness curdles. Now, this has huge impact for how we relate to our colleagues, our family, our friends, and has an impact on teamwork. So I think, I wrote my thesis many years ago on burnout in doctors. And interestingly, when doctors start to burn out, in combination to their emotional exhaustion and their lack of personal accomplishment, they also develop a thing called depersonalization, where they start to treat patients cynically or skeptically, or as though they weren't human beings. Now, this is what we do when we get stressed. Our bandwidth goes down, our ability to connect with people goes down, and the milk of human kindness curdles. But doctors who move along this continuum, and this is why there is a fantastic business case for this, as doctors move along this continuum from right to left, they actually make more clinical errors, they make more prescribing errors, they have a massive uptick in patient complaints because they don't treat patients in the same way as they do when they're feeling well. And they have a massive uptick in colleague complaints. They fall out with colleagues, and there's very disruptive and maladaptive behavior. So if anyone wants data on why this is a key performance indicator and relates to the bottom line, there is lots and lots of data. And if you look at patient complaints and the cost in Crown indemnity for doctors who are not communicating well with patients, there's a very powerful correlation between stress and doctor behavior, a much better correlation than between doctor knowledge and patient complaints. Patients tend to like doctors that they like and don't litigate them, but they don't like the doctor, they're much more likely to litigate whatever their clinical knowledge is. So let's just think about why this is so relevant. Well, this is work from Daniel Kahneman, and many of you will know this, but the great Daniel Kahneman demonstrated that 90% of the decisions that economists make are made by their unconscious brain, their unconscious mind. Now, economists found that rather difficult to compute. There have actually been 3 Nobel Prizes, Herbert Simon, Daniel Kahneman, Richard Thaler, all demonstrating the potency of emotion. And emotions actually account for about 90% of the decisions we make, our judgments and decisions. And I think if you look at the British political system and the American political system at the moment, you will see that the main driver towards behavior, voting behavior, has very little to do with facts. It has much, much more to do with emotion and what people feel about things. Now, this is really important because when you're feeling in different moods, you make different judgments about the same thing. So it's not what happens, it's the view you take about it. And understanding that is a really key mechanism to understanding how you can manage your mind. And I think this links to emotional literacy, psychological literacy, and that links to judgment and decision making. Now, I can't think of many leaders who wouldn't want to make better judgments and decisions. And I think this is a key way to look at how emotions and moods are driving and governing. They are the secret author of how we think, feel, and behave. So that, I think, makes a fairly powerful argument for why we should be focusing on it. I'd like to just talk a little bit about imagination, and I think this wonderful quote from John Milton. Imagination, I mean, lots and lots of people, philosophers and thinkers have argued that one of the things that really differentiates human beings from other primates is this capacity for imagination. Now, imagination is undoubtedly a gift, an extraordinary gift. And, you know, the fact that we can put a man on the moon, we can create Apple phones, and we can, you know, do all the extraordinary things that we're doing that our ancestors were unable to do. Because what we do is we what if. What if we tried this? Or what if we did that with that? Well, that could work. So what you're doing is running a little video in your mind's eye and thinking, well, what about if we did this? Now, this is a fantastic gift, and it links to innovation and creativity. And actually, even more potently, in collective intelligence, if we're doing this together in a group, it can be incredibly powerful. The tragedy is you can use exactly the same cognitive software, imagination, to terrify yourself. You can use that mind's eye, that video on fast forward, to create anticipatory threat. An anticipatory threat creates stress, real or imagined. And what's fascinating about imagined threats is that imagined threats have what's called functional equivalence, which means they activate about 90% of the neurons that the real threat would activate. So if I think there's an intruder in the house, I will activate 90% of the neurons that I would activate if there was an intruder in the house. I get a thumping heart, dry mouth, sweaty palms. It affects how I think, feel, and behave. And I think understanding this mechanism is absolutely key, because what are you using your mind for? And this is really important, because 96% of the things we worry about never happen. But when we're worrying about them, they activate a stress state. Interestingly, the 4% of things that do happen, we cope with them better, because we're better when we can deal with the situation than when we're imagining a situation. Now, they're not complex. These are concepts that people understand very readily. And there are fantastic tools and techniques for helping people manage their minds more effectively, that reduce those risk factors and protective factors. And interestingly, this links to a concept called neuroplasticity, which is the more you use your mind for something, the better you get at it. Now, that doesn't matter whether you're playing the violin, learning French, being a lawyer, being a neurosurgeon, flying an aeroplane. You will wire up billions and billions and billions of neurons for this. But if you worry, if you ruminate, if you have lots and lots of negative thoughts, you get better and better at it. And the tragedy is that the more often we have psychological problems, the more likely we are to relapse. So this becomes a learnt pattern, not intentionally. No one wants this. But why don't we teach people techniques that can help mitigate that process? And I think that would be a really healthy process. So this brings me to the sort of concept that what can we do? And I think this is understanding these risk factors and protective factors. Now, we know an awful lot of these. They're actually now recognized to be transdiagnostic. The techniques we use for treating a whole range of psychological problems, from anxiety to panic disorder to OCD to depression, are very, very similar. These psychological therapies actually work transdiagnostically, but they also work in our real world. You don't have to have a psychological problem for them to work. They work in our day-to-day lives. They work as we go around our routine. They have real world application. And the protective factors are also transdiagnostic. So they should be being taught. Actually, I think they should be taught in the workplace. They should certainly be taught to youngsters coming into the workplace. If you look at Kessler's work, 75% of all adult mental health problems have their genesis before the age of 25. We do very little to protect our young from the vicissitudes of life, some of which Alison outlined at the beginning. Life is tough. Life has ups and downs. But what we need to do is teach people how they can swim to the bank. We can't stop people falling in the water, because some of the reasons people fall in the water is their genetic loading, their genetic template, which gives them a predisposition. There was a great book written a couple of years ago called Orchids and Dandelions. We have a differential susceptibility or vulnerability. But then your early experiences also impact on whether you develop psychological problems. So you have a gene-environment interaction. But then your adult environment is capable of amplifying those problems or actually dampening down those problems. And that's why we could be doing so much more in the business world to try and mitigate this process. So I think the challenge is to put an understanding of those risk factors and protective factors into the organization where these are understood, and therefore they can be utilized to help people manage their own personal journeys. And I think that would be a fantastic process. So let's just briefly touch on the concept of emotional regulating systems. Now, this is actually Paul Gilbert's work. He's done a great deal of work on, and he's written a lovely book on it called The Compassionate Mind. I mean, he argues that we have these three big, and we have lots of regulating systems, but these three big regulating systems. Now, the biggest and the most dominant and the most powerful is a threat system. And that makes complete sense, because if you don't pay attention to threats, you tend to get taken out of the gene pool when you're a hunter-gatherer wandering around the savannah. So actually focusing on threat, being alert to threat, keeping your homeland security on hypervigilance has huge benefits to survival. And it hijacks all the other circuits. Now, the drive circuit is anticipatory. It's thinking about something that you want to achieve. It's working towards it. It's exciting. Just thinking about it, and here we have imagination again, thinking about achieving the thing can give you a sense of excitement and motivation. It drives up dopamine, and actually it's an incredibly powerful driver of behavior. However, and this is the sad thing, once you achieve whatever it is you achieve, whether that's your A-levels or university or promotion or whatever it is, or getting an Armani suit, it goes away pretty quickly. You have what's called hedonic adaptation. So here's another human universal, which is a bit of a quirk, is we tend to have a negativity bias, and we tend to have hedonic adaptation. So as soon as something's happened that's good, thank you very much, very nice, but it drifts off into the ether quite quickly. Now, this bottom bit, I think, is the bit that I think organizations can really pay attention to. They can reduce the threat system by actually creating an environment that is supportive and collaborative. But this soothing system is incredibly important, from the cradle to the grave. And actually, it pushes up dopamine, it pushes up oxytocin, it pushes up endorphins, and it creates a sense of safety. And I think working environments that can create that space, that mitigates threat. And it mitigates threat in children, it mitigates threat in adolescence, it mitigates threat in adulthood. And if we can feel that sense of safety, a sense of belonging, and again, Prof. Emmanuel was talking about the biggest factor influencing psychological health at work is a sense of belonging. Belonging actually makes us feel safer. And I'll tell you about some of the data linked to that soothing system. So if we can have a look at the, I'm going to find my notes here. If we can have a look at the concept of social support, this is actually active from the cradle to the grave. So if you look at little babies, if little babies receive love, nurture, touch, and all the things that good mums and dads give to their children, it has an amazing impact on their development, their cognitive development, their physical development. They thrive. If you look at the little babies that went into Ceausescu's orphanages, where they had their nappies changed and they were fed and watered, but they got no love, no emotional nourishment, their brains are about a third smaller. They're physically stunted. And what I'd like to get across here is that the way we relate to each other from the cradle to the grave is a form of neurobiological nourishment. It actually changes the expression of your genes, and it changes a whole range of factors. If you look at children who had traumatic early experiences, that has an epigenetic effect on the very neurological endocrine circuit that controls their cortisol and the glucocorticoid receptors in their hypothalamus. Now, I know that sounds very complicated, but what it means is their sensitivity to stress is re-altered, it's changed by their experience. So our experiences are not just experiences, they actually have a legacy. And we know that adverse childhood experiences have a toxic legacy. Being bullied, being excluded, being unloved as a child can have a very powerful legacy. But what we then need to do is think about how we can mitigate that process. And the good news is that there are ways to mitigate it. I mean, interestingly, just going back to Professor Emanuel, he quotes this question in his Q12 questionnaire, where belonging is the most powerful factor predicting job satisfaction, a sense of belonging, and having a friend at work. So that's a very interesting dynamic. About 70% of the population, on one study, argued they had no friends at work. And I think this again comes back, if we're spending a third of our life at work, how do we dial up social support? And why would we dial up social support? Do we need to? Okay, well, I'm just going to run through some very powerful research. If you do have adverse childhood experiences, and this was a recent paper that looked at social and emotional support, if these people who'd had adverse experiences always experienced good social support, that reduced their risk of depression by 87%. If you sometimes or usually experience social support, that reduced your risk by 69%. So social support protects against depression. It protects against it predicts rather, all measures of health, general health, depression, PTSD. If you look at the data from the armed services, it's the best protection. The social cohesion in your army unit is the best protection on the planet against developing PTSD. So I think there's a really powerful argument for focusing on how do you create a climate and environment that is supportive. Because if you do, it has a neuroendocrine impact. It changes your immune function. It changes cortisol. It links to your physical health. People who have good social support have more natural killer cells. They have more T helper cells. They have better immune function. And at a time of recurrent viral infections, that's probably quite a good thing to have. It improves your blood pressure. It reduces your risk of ischemic heart disease, metabolic disorders, diabetes. So this sense of belonging is incredibly powerful. And just a lovely study that was done by Robin Dunbar at Oxford, where he looked at the boating crew. When they trained alone, they had a certain level of a certain pain threshold. When they trained together, their pain threshold doubled. Now, I think we just need to understand that how we treat each other, how we talk to each other, how we relate to each other has a huge impact. And this links to trust, and trust and a sense of belonging are incredibly powerful, and they reduce distress. And interestingly, there's a big study just come out in Nature since COVID, interestingly, looking at social support, psychological flexibility, and coping. If you had good social support, your psychological flexibility improved, and cognitive and psychological flexibility correlate with mental health incredibly powerfully. But you also had better coping strategies, and you also experience less psychological distress. So this is an amazing way to help people manage difficulty. Now, this is our own data, and what it demonstrates is that social support, social connection is incredibly powerful at reducing stress and improving team collaboration. So I think organizations that are collaborative, supportive, collegiate, affiliative are going to get the inside track, but they're also going to recruit and retain people more effectively. And that's pretty important just at the moment. And we did some fascinating work with a big international law firm They shared all their data with us from health and well-being, engagement, but also exit interviews and one or two other. And we did our own insights assessment. And what was fascinating is that so we had over 100,000 data points. And when we did a factor analysis on those, if the partner, because we also had access to their billable hours, if the partner did three things: if they treated the junior lawyer with respect, if they were interested in the junior lawyer's, professional career, professional development, personal development, and the third thing is that the junior lawyer could have honest, open, authentic conversations. If those three factors were met, the junior lawyer actually spoke more favorably about the organization internally and externally. They had a lower level of attrition than other areas of the business. But here was the kicker. They actually had higher billable hours than any other area of the business. But they perceived their stress load as lower than other areas of the business where those factors were not met. So I think there is a business case. It's incredibly powerful, and actually all the research points in the same direction. So I'd like to just sort of finish by saying that, my summary note, I think the wonderful Maya Angelou sums this up so beautifully. We have, as human beings, through the fastest neural circuit in your brain, a process called social Wi-Fi. And this goes midbrain to midbrain. It's what's called an open loop. It goes amygdala to amygdala. And people make us feel a certain way. And how they make us feel actually makes us feel good or not so good. And I think this brain-to-brain coupling, this open loop, is an incredibly powerful mechanism. And we need to ask ourselves as organizations and as groups, how are we making other people feel? Because social support builds resilience. It also is a fantastic form of anti-fragility for individuals, for teams, and for organizations. And I think the more we can do in that range, I think the better. So I'm just going to summarize quickly. Going back to Alison's point at the beginning, there is a problem, and it really, really matters. I think there's something that we can do, and I think we can move upstream. I think there are three things that I would advocate. One is psychological education, because I think education is liberating, it's normalizing, and it's exculpating. It takes away shame and stigma because everyone realizes it's not just me, and this is part of the human condition. So I think that's really key. Emotional literacy links to emotional regulation, which links to building your own personal resilience framework. But I think that needs to be done in social groups, and that's why organizations have a wonderful opportunity. Social learning, and this is the work of Sandy Pentland at MIT, social learning is 4 times more powerful than individual learning in gaining behavior change. So that's the first thing, psychological education. The second thing, I think, is leadership. The tone from the top, the shadow of the leader, the cultural display rules, the norms, what we do around here, that is coming from the top. I spoke at an economist conference a few years ago, which was called Culture Eats Strategy for Breakfast. And that's Peter Drucker's great line. And nobody at that international conference questioned that. Culture does eat strategy for breakfast. And I think if you can create that social support, that intelligent kindness, that's going to increase psychological flexibility and reduce distress. And the final thing I'd say is it requires investment. And the investment requires time. The problem is, there's a wonderful paper, if you're interested, by Professor Beer in the Harvard Business Review called The Great Training Robbery. And he argues that you can have really, really good training, but if it doesn't actually translate into deep learning and experiential learning, it drifts off into the ether very quickly. And I think organizations who are going to invest in this need to actually make it part of a CPD process. It needs to be deep learning. It needs to be top down, bottom up. And we're lucky at Positive. We've got clients that we've worked with for over 10 years. And the impact we get from that, because we learn from them and understand what's going on for them, but they also, I hope, have learned from us what they can do to mitigate some of the things that we all meet on our journey through life. So I'm going to stop there and hand back to Alison.
Brian, thank you so much. I wish we had another hour just to talk and you know, explore some of the themes of today's discussion. I mean, I would just like to say, to summarize, I mean, I think there are a number of things, you know, businesses need to think about. I mean, I think there is a problem. And I think it would be really interesting for businesses to look at this kind of identification of chronic stress and sort of to measure the prevalence within organizations. I think your point around leadership is incredibly important. And, you know, we know over the course of this last sort of 2 years or so that leaders have been impacted personally, their mental health, the resilience, having to support mental health of teams. And I do wonder actually what the impact of that is on teams going forward. And, you know, you talked about depersonalization in doctors, and, you know, we talk a lot about empathetic leadership. And I do wonder whether the mental health of leaders is having an impact on the mental health of teams. And obviously that's something businesses, you know, should look at. And I know there was in a recent McKinsey Health Institute report on burnout, you know, toxic culture was identified, you know, as a leading contributor to team burnout. So I think that's a real pinnacle issue. And then lastly, I just want to make a comment around the social connection piece and social support. And actually lots of businesses now looking at hybrid working, thinking about how that may be impacting upon social connection. So that would certainly be another area to look at. But we have run out of time, so unfortunately we can't continue the discussion. But I just want to say thank you, Brian. That was fantastic. And also a thank you again to Sarah Henshaws and the team at Allen & Overy. Just for those on the event, we do have our next event coming up at 4:20, so in a couple of minutes time. And that is our ESG panel discussion on putting the wellbeing of employees into the S of ESG. So please do join us for our next event. But in the meantime, thank you very much.
Bye, everybody.